Hey everybody, welcome to Oregon State University's Permaculture Design Pro class. This is our manyth office hour. I believe this is our 8th office hour. This is the summer fall 2023 course. We got some great questions today from Janet and from Louisa, and I'm looking forward to jumping into it. So I think that's exactly what we'll do. All right. So Janet starts our questions off. They're good questions. So can you talk a little bit more about planning for wildfire? I'm confused about how to balance the need for different heights of trees for windbreaks, but remove understory to protect against wildfire. I'm assuming the only way to really do this is to space your windbreak rows of different heights so that they don't touch the higher canopy. Am I missing something? So it's a great question. There's a lot of different elements that come into planning for wildfire. There's an amazing book called The Bushfire Safety Guide, created and written by Joan Webster, OEM. Joan was a nurse turned journalist, and she wrote about fire safety for so many years that she started to put together all of her learnings into guides, which was then adopted by the Australian government. And she's been credited to saving lives during many of the Black Fridays and Saturdays and Sundays that they've had over the years. We did a great webinar a couple years back. So if you go to my YouTube channel, there's a great conversation about that. But her book is exceptional. So kind of going through the high level of her book and then coming down. First and foremost, you should have a large fire break around any facility areas. So any structures that could burn down, you want to have usually somewhere between 10 to 15 meters. So somewhere around 30 to 50 feet. And you want to make sure that that break has no flammable vegetation to it. Tomatoes, not flammable. Eucalyptus, very flammable. So being conscientious that we're not putting volatile species in between that break is important. Hydrating that area, so things like hugelkultur and swales can be great in that area. When we had a fire near me back in 2015, there were these big long rows of slash. They had just taken forestry and they'd thrown it on the ground. And over time, they'd used it as a dumping pile. So they'd just been dumping soil there. And it was amazing. You could see the ground fire come up to this inadvertent hugelkultur and stop because hugelkulturs are so wet. So it was a really interesting learning for me because I had always thought that hugelkultur would just be more soil, but really from a ground fire perspective, they're very moist. The other thing to consider is that we have a few different types of fires. We have a ground fire, a crown fire. Ground is on the ground, crown fire is in the crown of trees. And one of the main things we want to avoid is a ground fire becoming a crown fire. So that means that there's ladder fuels in between. These are trees or branches or dead snakes that have all these branches that are there. So that way a ground fire can then get up into the shrub layer, get up into the lower canopy, and climb up these ladder fuels. This can also include things like vines that have died out. This will then bring everything into the crown. And unfortunately, once the fire gets into a crown, it increases speed, it increases the amount of oxygen it takes up, and it increases its heat factor. This also creates a major issue, which is the ember front. So as a wildfire is moving and growing, it'll create an ember front. This is the embers or the sparks that it's throwing ahead of itself. In Australia, it's been cataloged to be somewhere between like 3 to 5 kilometers. If it hits a wind, you can throw a spark. And Joan and others in Australia have really clued in that when you're protecting a home against a wildfire, it's not the flame so much you have to be worried about, it's the sparks. And this is why in her book, she talks about ensuring that the outside of the house doesn't have any flammable nature or inlets that could bring in sparks into the house. And this is why she recommends using very fine metal screen on anything that could bring in sparks into the eaves of the house or different inlets within the house. And one of the reasons why when she is an advocate for, and when you defend your house, so you don't leave your house, which is very opposite to what Canadian institutions and what we're taught in Canada and in North America in the States, is when you stay and defend your house, which is not what people advise, or governmental institutions advise in North America. When you stay and defend your house, you are to face your house, not face the fire, because you're always scanning the house to see if there's been any penetration of the fire into the house. And this is why when it happens, you're holding backpack sprayers and you're basically spotting anything that might create ignition. Going back to the fire breaks. So once you have a fire break or you have an area that is without fuel, one of the things, and this is where Joan and I may have some differing opinions, her conversation is no mulch around the house whatsoever, because mulch can dry out. And it's true, that's the point of mulch. You know, the first couple of inches of mulch is to dry out, so the bottom inches are a bit wet, so that way your soil's wet. And I get it. And at the same time, it's a moisture harvesting technique. So that's one of those decisions we all have to make for ourselves. It's never going to be exactly perfect. Her big thing is just to take full compost and have the compost as mulch. So the compost then is used as mulch. It's a higher organic matter. It's harder to burn. I get it. It's a bit problematic. Once we get into the forest, now we're talking about, or whatever your climax ecology is, because not everything climaxes in forest. Now we're talking about spacing and thinning. And so generally, within spacing and thinning, we're talking about 3 to 5 meters. So we're anywhere from like 10 to 20 feet in between stems, in between trunks of trees. So we want quite a bit of space in between. And then we want to limb up anything in the under canopy, usually to the reach of a pole pruner. So as high as you can get, 10 to 15 feet, somewhere in there. So if you think about it, you basically have this triangle of 10 to 15 feet, sometimes 20 feet in between stems. And then as you're coming up under the canopy, you then have that space as well. So really all you have is the bark, and the bark is inherently fire resistant. It's not fireproof, but it is fire resistant. And there's a high likelihood that these elements are going to not ignite if you do have a ground fire that goes through it. At that point, we start talking about wet breaks. So is there any way that we can bring water into this landscape and create wet areas that might be able to break a ground fire? It won't break a crown fire, because if the fire is up in the crown, it'll go over it. But that can be very useful. So these could be ponds, these could be terraces, these could be things like even check dams, things that are listed within the low-tech erosion control course on regenerative living .online. All of those can help to increase the hydration of a landscape. And again, an increased hydration of a landscape will ensure that things don't burn as much. The other thing is prescription burning. So years ago, I created a documentary called Facing Fire, Building Resiliency to Wildfire. You can find it on my YouTube channel. And what was so fascinating is during that process, I got to know the Yurok First Nation and the Cultural Fire Management Council, Elizabeth Azus and Margot Robbins. And I learned how to light fire. Instead of being a firefighter, we were fire lighters. And learning that really brought in another tool into my toolbox. This is not a tool that is universally accepted within the permaculture regenerative ag space. For example, David Holmgren is not a proponent of cultural burning. I think he's a proponent of cultural burning, but I think his big beef from a conversation I had with him is that it's burnt carbon. So instead of being into a longer carbon cycle, it's burnt carbon and it's an issue. I have found that in my situation, as I started to practice burning in short form around my landscape, basically after the last snowfly, we would start to burn the grasses and make space so that way there wasn't as much fuel load around the house. It really dropped my anxiety about a ground fire coming up to the house via grass. So I really appreciated having that tool. And it was so great to go and learn with them. And so I would say if you have an opportunity or if you're interested in learning about it, I would seek out either prescription burning or cultural low intensity fire burning, just to understand the process, understand it from a firefighter's perspective, and then you can play with it on the small scale. And it's relatively easy to manage on the small scale. You're managing it with rakes and a hose, but generally you're doing it at a time of year where things aren't dry. You're doing it when they're slightly wet. So I was usually doing it in the spring, and there was still wetness in the ground. That was my training wheels. I did it that way so I could have some training wheels. But all of that to say that you kind of start in the big scope of things, and then you move into the house, and then from the house you move out. So it's like most of permaculture design, it's a spiral. You're moving out from the house and in from the outside, and out from the house and in from the outside, to get a sense of where is that fire danger. And then the last thing I'll say, maybe there might be more. One of the last things I'll say is there's the fire triangle, and the fire triangle is oxygen, ignition sources, and fuel. So if you can break that triangle, so if you can break oxygen, if you can break ignition, or if you can break fuel sources, you can inherently break fire risk. So think of that if you're ever going from a first principles perspective. How can I break this triangle from any of these perspectives? And then think about, if you are going to fight or defend your home, what are the tools and processes that are at your disposal? One of the major issues when people talk about defending their homes is they start talking about sprinkler systems, which are great. These are usually heat activated valves that will then allow the sprinklers that are installed on the top of houses to spray. Problem is once there's a fire, almost all electricity is cut off to that area in case there's an issue. So your fire suppression systems need to be gravity based. They need to be non-electrical based, so that way you have that water at hand. Or they need to be generator based, and then you have to have a full system if you don't use your generators normally, to then maintain them and check them and make sure they're topped up and fueled up. Usually fire-based or the firefighting based generators are specific to that. They're left by themselves. You don't use them for anything else, which is hard for those of us that live in a homestead or are working in this sort of way, because we use everything for everything. Assuming the only way to really do that is space your windbreaks. Yeah, so the windbreaks as well, in terms of heights and canopies and things like that, yeah, it matters a bit, but really once things are into the crown and you have an ember front, eventually that fire will move. So if you can space them out, and this is one of the reasons why silviculture and agroforestry is so important, is if you're doing rows of trees and you're doing grazing animals in between, it's essentially a fire break because you're not having that touching canopy. That's really the big thing, is we've been in fire exclusion for so long. We have excluded fire from our landscapes that almost all of our landscapes are so dense in terms of their trees that everything is touching. And so just learning about thinning at 10 to 15 feet, or allowing for canopy spacing. So you have two trees and they're touching, that's an issue. And so that can also be a gauge about how to thin. I know we had questions about that from somebody else in terms of thinning. Basically, if you have canopy touching, it's a good idea to thin and reduce that fire load. One of the main issues is, how do you remove that much fuel from a forest? It's a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of energy. One of the suggestions I designed for a client was, they had goats, and so we created a goat chute that came all the way down their landscape. And then they had little gates that they could then electrify fence, and then the goats could go in there and they could bring down that lower shrub layer, because they'll denude a landscape if you leave them long enough. And it was a great way to reduce fuel load. So working with animals and grazing animals is fantastic. I talk about it in the documentary, how working with grazing animals can reduce fire load. It's one of the reasons why we would do prescription burning in the spring, and then into the summer we would bring in the horses and they would basically lawnmower everything around the house. That's a fair amount of information. Janet, any follow-up questions or thoughts about that?
So I'm just wondering, I want to make sure that I can make the trees work as both a windbreak and be fire safe. So the main key there is just planting them far enough apart that the canopies don't touch. And then you're still going to have like different levels, like your lower level and then your upper level, to help with the wind protection, right?
Yeah, that's right. So sometimes these systems will work at cross purposes if we include all potential hazards. So when we're looking at that windbreak, they are rather tight. And so they do have a bit of a fire risk, but if there's a big span of pasture in between one and another, then there is less fire risk. And you're in Wyoming, which does get fires. Just going to check out your base map here.
I don't think I have a huge fire risk on my property because half our land is surrounded by a canal.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that your fire risk is very high at all, as I'm starting to look at it here. No, I would say your only fire risk is kind of the southwest corridor there. But the other thing is that fire usually moves uphill versus downhill, and the height of land is higher on your south and western borders. I should show this. So the height of land is higher on your southern and western borders, if I'm reading this correctly. I don't think you've got labels on here, you just got colors. Yeah, I would think if you end up putting windbreaks on your southern side or on your western side, you'll be in fine order.
You can't really see on that map, but there's also a couple of ponds over there.
Yeah, like this one.
On that. Yeah, there's that one. And then well, I guess that's the eastern side. The eastern side has ponds on it.
Yeah, I'm just gonna see if we've got something a bit tighter. Okay, here we go. Right, the eastern side. Okay, this side, eh?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I wouldn't say you have much to worry about in terms of fire. This doesn't look like there's enough fuel to bring it closer to you. Wow,
Okay,
you're so
thank you.
close to the airport. Whew.
Yeah, but there's not much at the airport.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, great. Awesome. Thanks for the question. Question 2, video 14 in lesson 7, learning material talked about using mushrooms to filter and clean water. Love to hear any more input you might have about this. I have a wastewater ditch that runs to our property from an adjacent farm and think there might be a potential for cleaning. Yes, awesome. So yeah, the book you'll want to take a look into and digest is Mycelium Running, How Mushrooms Can Save the World by Paul Stamets. He did a brilliant job of describing it. Basically, what you're doing is you're building out straw bales or blocks of bunker spawn. And so usually what you do is you get your myceliated spawn from, which is usually on grain, spent grain, or rice is the other one. And then you're inoculating a hay bale or a straw bale. Could use either, it doesn't really matter. One of the things that Paul Stamets really popularized was this idea of pseudo pasteurizing your straw, so that way it's a blank canvas. This is one of the things you have to be conscientious of when you're working with mushrooms, is that you need to have an uncontaminated medium to then colonize. And so they do a lot of heat pasteurization, which is an incredibly energy intensive process. And what he found is that if you would take this straw bale or straw in general, and he would submerge it in water for 24 to 48 hours, basically that environment that is the straw bale would go from terrestrial to aquatic. It would go from aerobic to anaerobic, oxygen, no oxygen. And what would happen is all of the terrestrial life forms that would be competing with the mushrooms would die. And so there was a little window of a couple of hours after he brought out the hay bale, put it directly in the sun or the straw bale, and then have the sun beat down on it as well as airflow, where you would remove everything that was colonized from an anaerobic perspective, and there would be this window where nothing was colonized. So it was kind of like it was pasteurized, not really. And then what you do is inoculate it. So basically you layer in your myceliated spawn into these straw bales, or you get these bunker bags, which can either be geowoven textile or they can be jute, like coffee bags, coffee grounds. And then what you'll do is you'll layer straw, you'll layer spawn, straw, spawn, straw, spawn, straw, spawn, let it myceliate out. And the big thing about mushrooms and the way that they filter water, another great book to read and learn more about this is Earth Repair by Lila Darwish. Earth Repair by Lila Darwish. Is the amount of time that the water is in contact with the mushroom. The more time the water is in contact with the mushroom, the better chance it has to hyper accumulate any heavy metals, any toxicity, and work upon it. This is the great thing about mushrooms, is mushrooms are hyper accumulators. They will pull in what is around them, or they will work through epigeneticus. So basically, when the mycelium, which is just the single strands of mushrooms, and mushrooms are made up of mycelium, it's the roots, it's the matter, it's what comes up. When those little strands go out and they interact or touch, let's say diesel, because there's a great example there in Myceliated Running about this, and they start to interact with it, they start to produce different types of exudates that come off of their mycelium. A single mycelium is called a hyphae. And then they give that information back to the entire mycelial network. And so the entire network goes, oh, interesting, we have this hydrocarbon. Let's see if we can digest it. Let's see if we can eat it. And so the more time there is in connection to it, the more interaction you'll have. And so what Paul learned and what Lila dived into is, if you have a channel that's coming down, you basically make like a 1 sack or 2 sack or a 1 straw bale dam. So that way the water comes up behind, fills up and overflows. So that way it has connection. And then you have 3 or 4 of these types of these rows. So that way you have these multiple rows. Now, if you're following along, the idea of hyperaccumulation, if there's toxicity in the water, that's in the mushrooms now. So this doesn't become an edible, this doesn't become both a filtration system and an eating system. It's usually just filtration. Now, the big question is, what do you do with the mushrooms after they're so filled with potential toxicity? Generally, incineration is what everybody recommends. Because it's just there, you could compost it again. So there is some good data that shows that composting will make most of what the toxicity is now, which in the case of like hydrocarbons would be heavy metals, in the case of contamination would be neurotoxins, would become bio unavailable through compost. So you could take those mushrooms and then compost them for both the thermophilic and the mesophilic stage. So 1 year working with getting that compost up to 60 degrees centigrade, turning it, doing it again, doing it a third time, and then letting it sit. But that's kind of the easiest way to go about doing that. What I would do if it were is I would test the water first. I would send it to a local water testing facility, wherever is close, get a sense of what's in the water, and then I would specifically choose mushrooms that were associated with being able to filter out those issues. The other elements you may want to work with is the Helianthus family. So this includes things like sunflowers, sunchokes. Helianthus is also very good as a hyperaccumulator. It will suck up whatever is in its situation. But again, now we have a contaminant. So we have to think that we've taken it out of the area, we've put it into a plant or a mushroom, and now we need to deal with that. So you could potentially just have a specific compost pile with that material. And if you wanted to approach it from a citizen science perspective, I would then take that material and test it after a year of thermophilic composting, which is hot composting, and then mesophilic, which is low temperature or medium temperature. It's probably how I would go about it. And then test the water afterwards, of course. So, after that water is coming through those bunker spawns, then testing that as well. Now, if this is happening long term and your neighbor is never going to stop, it's not like a point source issue where it's just one and done. I might take a look into the work of John Todd and his living machines, or living green machines. They used to be called living green machines, and now they're living machines. I would take a look into his work and see if you may not be better off creating a totally constructed living wetland that the water then coursed through multiple times, and you used all of these tools, but instead of doing it in the ditch, you actually made a maze, if you will, to give it lots of time, the water, lots of time to be in contact with lots of living elements that could then filter the water long term. So that would all be based upon what's in the water, what's the contamination level, and then using a little bit of budget development to understand what's the cost to do one treatment versus the other.
Yeah, a constructed wetland it would definitely be doable because it runs into a pond already. So I'm interested in cleaning up that area as well.
Nice. Yeah. So I would say take a look at John Todd's work, or probably not, or this would be more of an and, is creating a living oasis with gray water, which would be Art Ludwig. His work went into this a bit, but it might give you some ideas. I think probably John Todd's going to be the better of the two. And then Lila's work as well. We were actually going to run a course with Lila this year into remediation with mushrooms and plants, and mycology and microbiology, but she got sick, so she declined. Great question.
Thank you. Thanks for the resources.
You're welcome. Yeah, you're totally welcome. Louisa's question is, I've just learned about drylands, temperate zones, and tropics a lot. However, what about the subtropics? Are they just a mix between temperate and tropics when it comes to soil and planting? Is anything important to mention? A few keywords and I can do the research. Yeah, so let's talk about a couple of the differences between tropics. And I'm just going to share my screen. This is a digitized copy of the Permaculture Designer's Manual, which you can find online if you look. That's all I'll say about that. So really, when we're taking a look at tropics, between tropics and subtropics, so tropics, subtropics, and warm temperate is really frost. So once we don't have any frost, we're into the subtropics, and I believe it's 18 degrees as an average temperature. Once we're below 18 degrees as an average temperature, we're into the subtropics. So that kind of gives us a climate delineation. Now back to the question at hand. I'm just going to share back the screen with the question. What about the subtropics? Learn about drylands. Are they just a mix of the two? When it comes to soil and planting, is there anything important to mention? Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about how they're different. I'm just going to parse this out. So are they just a mix between temperate and tropics when it comes to soil and planting? Yes and no. So generally, if we're thinking about soil, in the temperate climates, the soil is usually nutrition rich because the temperates don't grow as much as the tropics. Whereas with the tropics, you have 365 growing, and there's always something going. So we joke, but it's true. The nutrition in the tropics is in the air in terms of all the vegetation, and in the temperates, it's in the ground, because it doesn't have that continuous growing cycle. There's die-off in the winter. Roots tend to slough off some of their nutrition during the winter. Sometimes there's growth. It depends on species, but there's that difference between the two. When we get to tropics, there's continuous growing, always moving, but we're also into that 18 Celsius per monthly average. Once we change and we get into the subtropics, it means that we're getting a little bit cooler. We're getting some variation. We're not getting full monsoon if we're in the wet tropics. And if we're in the dry tropics, we're not having that huge amount of drought. Usually it's a bit more moderated, like Mediterranean climate. So some things to think about is a lot of the solutions of both in terms of soil building will work in the subtropics, which is one of the nice things about being there. So things like hugelculture, vermicomposting, lasagna gardening, all of those tools and techniques will work. And usually it's an average precipitation, like 500 mil. So you're not worried about things getting too wet. You are worried about things getting too dry. So usually increasing the water holding capacity by increasing the surface area of the soil. That is to say, we want more particles, or PEDs, PED, which is a molecule of soil that has more surface area. And this is one of the reasons why we always talk about the solution to building good soil is organic matter, or OM, organic matter, because we want to increase that amount of surface area, and organic matter has a massive amount of surface area. This is why biochar is so popular, is because it's recalcitrant carbon. So basically you burn wood or carbon material at low oxygen, so that way the fire doesn't consume all the material, it just off gases, which is usually what's burning in fire. And so it creates all of this substructure. It removes a lot of structure in the wood internally, so it has a very high surface area capacity. So I think all of those things are important. All of those soil building techniques are important. Animals in the subtropics can help to make or break a system, because the animals will, if we're using them correctly and we're using them to graze or browse, grazing being grass, browsing being on shrubs or perennial woody perennials, they can take just a little bit off the tree or off the grass, and if we're conscious about when we move them, then they can produce more vegetation, which produces more roots, which produces more soil over time. So I would say all of those pieces are important to keep in mind. A mix between soil and tropics. So one of the things about the subtropics versus the tropics is there can be more specific, or there can be less seasonality. So with wet tropics, we can have a monsoon season. And so the monsoon will come on, and generally you can't plant anything during the monsoon that isn't aquatic. Or you can't plant the seeds because the seeds will run away. The nice thing about the subtropics is it's usually more moderate and you don't have that type of issue. Dry tropics or arid tropics, similarly, you have a bit more moisture, it's more distributed. So again, it's easier generally. You don't have as much issues to deal with. Same thing with pests. So subtropics are usually a bit more moderated in terms of temperature, and so there aren't as many pests or viruses or diseases that are coming into that situation. So I think all of that can be an important thing. If you're looking for keywords, yeah, so subtropics, regenerative agriculture, subtropics, permaculture, and then soil development, soil planting, anything like that. I just did a quick search and it seemed like there was a bunch that came up, and all are really good to use. Let me think if I have anything else to say about that. No, I think that's about it. And I don't think Louise is on here today. I think it's, yeah, no. Okay, so I'm gonna pause there. Any follow-up questions from anybody who's on the call about those topics, or any additional questions? Okay, I'm just gonna pop over to lesson 8, talk a little bit about the plant system design. So I'd like to make sure we're all on the same page. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the survey is rather self-explanatory, but the plant system design is one of the first design processes that you're going to start to play with. So one of the reasons that we built the course the way we did and developed it the way we did is so maybe what I'll do is I'll move everything over to there we go. It's better. I'm looking at you folks. So let's talk about the plant system design. So one of the reasons we developed this the way we did in terms of the entire template is now you've got your base map, your microclimates, your zones. You have all of these layers that you can start to play with. This is one of the first times that we're going to start actively designing an element within your site. And this is a great opportunity to go back through and take a look at the examples, because there's lots of great examples about design. The example we have here really showcases, first and foremost, what are the existing conditions? So what are we dealing with? So this is an opportunity to go back to your base map, pull from your base map, either do it in a light color or a grayscale, so that way it's very clear to see. And then here, what we start taking a look at is probably something new for most folks, is this idea of patterns and strategies. So one of the patterns here, I'm going to zoom in. One of these patterns is either patterns of influence or patterns of what we may want to design around. So things like, okay, we know we want a view screen here, and we know we have winds, so some kind of edible windbreak. Again, we've got a view screen issue because of how the house was being viewed. The tiny house was being viewed from the main house, so we know we need a little bit more view screen. We know we have a lot of water here, so we're going to try and capture overland water flow. And we wanted to create some kind of seasonal solar bowl. So this is you starting to pull from all the lessons, the video lessons, the resources that you've watched throughout the entire course and starting to think about what are the patterns that we're seeing here, either an influence or what we're going to apply. So as we go here, you can see that for this example, goal 1 was to build resilience to summer drought and reduce microclimate extremes. Some of the patterns were cold season, solar bull, edible windbreak, capture overland flow. So those are the big patterns. So the strategies then are to block winter wind, capture solar heat to extend growing season while maintaining an adequate water flow. Better management will include drought tolerant plants, ground cover or mulch, capture overland flow with earthworks. So now we're getting into what that might mean. This is vegetative boomerang swale or microbasins, which go around specific trees to help to feed those trees with water. 2 or more 55-gallon rain barrels north of the house and gravity-fed irrigation lines. One of my main feedbacks on this design was that 55-gallon rain barrels are gone in a moment and they fill in a moment. They're almost too small to even be playing with. So if you are going to work with rainwater capture, definitely take a look into IBC totes. They're 1,000 liters, 250 gallons. They're used to ship liquid all over the world. They come in an aluminum cage. You'll want to get the food grade kind, and you'll usually want to get food grade that are working with some kind of organics just to make sure that there's nothing gnarly in there. And then possible solar pump from pond to storage of level of tiny house for gravity fed irrigation. Again, if you only have 255 gallons and you're investing in a pond pump, the return on energy investment is just never going to get there. Goal 2, same patterns, but this time it's a yield. So notice this is the resiliency to water. And notice now we're saying, well, let's get a yield from this. So now it's about what are we putting in here? So specifically, it's talking about the different types of plants that might be here, specifically nitrogen fixers, biomass producers, living mulch, insectaries, all that. And then finally, at the last, create sheltered area around tiny house for a warmer microclimate. So again, privacy, shelter belts, things of that nature. So when we come back to this example, we'll put our plan here, make sure the scale is correct, put in our title block, put in our legend. May want to have a base map here to show how this area that we're focusing on interacts with the larger site. And then we're going to go into our goals. Now, if you have more goals, you'll need more slides, but all of that is fine and good. There's a couple of great examples here on the left-hand side. I personally really enjoy the Natural Capital Plant Database. Fantastic resource if you're new to plants or researching plants, also Plants for a Future. The USDA Plant Database is great. There's so many good examples on how to work with and use. And then we get into subtropical plant list, things like that as well. So, and all of these are linked, so you just have to click on them. Then we get into the system design. So how do you start planning and designing your system if you've never done it before? So usually we take an anchor. Usually there's some tree or some species we want to put in that'll be the anchor for this. So if you're just designing a guild, it'll be that key species, and then we're going to design around it. Number one mistake people make, they crowd their designs. They put too much in. This has a twofold problem. One, plants can't grow to the full size and interact with each other well. And 2, the people can't get into and manage those designs. So this was after I gave feedback here, but you'll see here that there's actually these little pathways to get in and around the plant so you can manage them. You only manage you can only manage what you can access. So if you can't access it, you can't manage it. So you really need to be conscientious of how you're going to get in and manage it. Then we get into the idea of aesthetic design. So talking about building in clumps of 3s and 4s and 5s. So what I'm going to do here, hopefully I'm not going to muck up too many things by creating a new slide, but I need a blank template to play with. So if we start designing, I'm going to give you a quick tutorial here on designing. Here we go. Okay. So if we start designing, we're going to usually have our mainstay species. It'll be some kind of usually a tree of some sort, usually put the trunk in there. And then we have to think about coming into this space and what this means. So if we have a north arrow, pardon me, if we know the direction of what's around this, so say this is our north, then we know that the north side is going to be a little bit more shady and usually a bit moist. The south is going to be hotter and drier, and the east and the west are going to be variations of this. So generally when I'm designing, I start to think of designing in rooms. And designing in rooms is this idea that's been around for a long time, but you kind of think about designing in sectors. So let's move off of that drawing tool and onto this one. So we have these sort of bubbles and circles we can design in. So we can design in, you know, threes, we can design in maybe a south and a north, depending on access or if there's other trees beside. We may design in something that's a little bit offset. So we've got, you know, two areas to play with on the back and an area in the front. But play with this idea, or we could reverse the whole thing and we could do a big area in the back, and then we have two sort of side areas in the front. Notice that I'm giving space for access, so that way a person can come in, person could come in here, a person could come in here, and they have access to come in and out. So if we start to see this in 3D, I'm going to switch my tool again. And I'm going to make sure the color's right. So if we start designing, so if this is our plan view and this is our cross section or our render. So this is our trunk and this is our ground. Now we have to start thinking about clumping and about stacking. So clumping in 3s, 4s, and 5s is really important because it gives you a sense of height. So if you do have, you know, some kind of nitrogen fixer to support here, chances are it's probably going to be a shrub, something like Elaeagnus multiflora or umbellata if you're in temperate climates. Lots to deal with or work with in the subtropics and tropics. And then we want to think, well, there's probably only going to be one of those. And so if we're coming down and if we start putting smaller shrubs, we're probably going to group a few. And you can already start to see that we're starting to come down in size. So it kind of creates this very nice edge that comes up and down. And then we may have some lower bearing ground covers or plants as well that then create this bottom layer. And now as we play with this in both levels, so let's do this here as well. So that'll be here. Oh. I like that Zoom gave us the ability to change these, but it's really hard to get used to all of a sudden. All right. And then what was the other color? Orange? Yeah, nice. And so we probably got some tall columars like some hollyhocks or something like that. So this would be one of those clumps where we have this area placed out so that way from a visual perspective, which is another way you may want to design, is being conscious about the heights of these things. But notice that we can get in and we can manage almost every aspect of this versus this middle element. Now, if these are flowers as insectaries, we don't have to worry about the management of them. We may want to cut a few for cut flowers inside the house or for sale. But generally, this is going to be a good process to play with. So this is a simple way to design. You can start here and just play with size and color, and then you can take a look and see, well, I'm looking for something if this is, let's start to get some sense of sizing. This tree is, let's say, 20 feet. Then this one's going to be about 10. This one might be like 6, and this may be a foot or 2. And that just gives you a sense of stacking them so visually it looks very beautiful, because beautiful landscapes are managed. And for those that were interested, Jamie Wallace is going to be doing a course on this. He's had some family emergencies he's had to deal with. So we're just, if you did sign up for the list, we're going to be sending out an email this week to talk about when that new timing is. But this gives you a sense of these different elements. One of the major things that everyone gets wrong when they're doing perennial design is they'll only choose an annual nitrogen fixer for a perennial key species. So generally, I want redundancy in my nitrogen fixers. So I want a nitrogen fixer both at my, let's choose black here. I want a nitrogen fixer both at the shrub level, and then maybe I'll do some peas or something around here. That's fine. But we definitely want to have, if we've got a key species here, and this key species is fruit bearing, let's say, we want to support it also with a perennial nitrogen fixer as well, N2 fixer. So just keep that in mind. I say it every year, and every time the next batch of plant system design, it's always, I want to see more nitrogen fixers. And I don't just want to see beans and clover. I want to see something within that spectrum. So definitely take a look at nitrogen fixers. There's some great resources within that first slide there about nitrogen fixers. Any questions about plant design and layout as we're doing this. The reason I'm going through this is once you make another plant, there's another niche opportunity. So the south side of that plant is now going to create a bit of a heat trap or a bit of bounce light. On the north side, it's going to create some wetness. I like working with cardinal directions, so you can kind of think about working on the north side or the south side or southeast or southwest. This is just an example of how to start to group the plants. Any thoughts about this? Any comments? Okay, awesome. Any other questions that are coming to anybody as we're just chatting about? Okay, sounds good. Well, just a reminder that all assignments are due December 4th at 9 a.m. That includes all resubmissions as well. There is no late assignments that are accepted. So definitely be conscientious about managing your time. And thanks so much for showing up today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Always welcome.
Thanks.
Welcome, Sam.